Well, hi everyone, and welcome to another episode of Club Grubbery, coming to you from New South Wales in Australia and from the UK with our special guest tonight in Des Collins, who happens to be a solicitor in the UK, and he's coming to talk to us about the infected blood scandal. John, we've been wanting this one for a long time.
Yeah, look, it's an absolute shocker that's been left behind here in Australia, unlike in the UK, and it'll be great to get to the bottom of it for the sake of all those that have been horrifically affected here in Australia.
And indeed around the world. And we were talking to a very upfront doctor in the USA recently who said they've had the same issues over there. So I think we should get straight into it. Des, thank you for appearing on the show.
Pleasure.
Unpack the scandal that is the infected blood scandal that's happened around the world, and in particular, your involvement in it in the UK.
It's been there for about 40 or 50 years and really started in the late 60s, early 70s. And what happened was, to cut a very, very long story short, what happened was that particularly with the haemophiliac community, there was a breakthrough in treatment, or what we thought was a breakthrough in treatment in the early 70s, late 60s, whereby blood products could be imported from America and from Europe into the UK. And those blood products could be distributed to haemophiliacs, which meant if they had a bleed, they didn't need to go through the complex process of self-administration of what was called cryoprecipitate. I won't go into that, but cryo was more difficult. They had to go back to the fridge, the whole bit. So all of a sudden, this breakthrough comes along, and it's heavily marketed by the pharma companies, and everyone thinks it's basically God's gift to haemophilia, the community. What happened was effectively that the blood products which were being imported into the UK and imported everywhere, or exported everywhere, if you depending how you look at it, became contaminated. And in order to produce these blood products, you had to have a huge pool of blood. In order to distill them effectively, you had to have this huge pool of blood, and that pool of blood had to be collected from wherever. And effectively, I mean, I'm not into politics, and I'm not into. I don't want to dwell on this, but effectively, the pharma companies thought, well, the only way we can get blood at this level is by paying for it, and the only way we can get it cheaply and quickly is by going into the drug community, the et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Basically, I'm not being argumentative here, into the low life community, and that people will pay, will give blood for £2 or $2 or whatever you want, and that's important money to them. So then the pharma companies decided, well, the next way you can get it is by going into prisons, and if people are in prison, they ain't got a great deal to do, so they'll give blood quickly and cheaply, etc., etc., etc. Now the problem with this, and it was the wrong place at the wrong time, was that we always knew that blood could be contaminated. We always knew that blood could be contaminated with Hep B and hepatitis B, and latterly hepatitis C, as it became known. But what we didn't know was that the AIDS virus was about to hit. And it was the hitting of the AIDS virus at that time, with the blood being used for or the blood products being used for distribution, which meant that not only were you distributing blood products with Hep B and Hep C in them, you were the distribution was with HIV effectively and AIDS. And once that happened, the problem with the world at that time was we were all taken completely by surprise by HIV and AIDS, not so much by Hep B, Hep C, because that had been, well, Hep B had been around since just after the war. Hep C, as it was known in those days, Hep non-A, non-B, was a more recent realization. I wouldn't say discovery, but we realized what it was. So you then said, but as I say, you got in the early 70s this crisis, and a lot of vested interest, be it pharma companies and government interest, had been created, so that when the voice in the wilderness, or the voices in the wilderness, said, hang on, stop this, stop this, stop this. There were so many people saying, no, come on, you're just being difficult, you're being stupid, it's an overreaction. And so there was no reaction. And this went on until the late 70s. In that period, a lot of people died. A lot of people picked up Hep B and Hep C, and a lot of people picked up AIDS. Now, having got I've got some experience of Canada, because not that I practiced there, but I've looked at when we were developing in the UK the arguments to get where we are today. I looked at Canada very closely. The problem was, as I say, that people wouldn't listen, and it was regarded as something which, if you ignored for long enough, it would go away. And you've also got the age-old problem that if you make a mistake, and we all know that from being at school, if you make a mistake, the teacher will say, own up to it quickly, we can sort it out and we'll move on. But if you make a mistake and you don't own up to it quickly, and you basically lie about it and cover it up, then that will go on and become worse and worse. And certainly, as I said, I've got some experience of Canada, certainly a lot of experience of the UK, because I spent my last 8 or 9 years dealing with it. But in the UK, every time someone said to government, you got this wrong in 1971, 72, you've got to put it right, these people need care and attention, etc. They said, no, we didn't. The phrase was always, we did everything that could have been done at the time. And that phrase was used time and time again. It was a line to take, and it was used through the 70s, 80s, 90s, noughties, and up until effectively 2017, when the government finally conceded in the UK that we could have a public inquiry. That public inquiries went on, finally reported last year, and we're now dealing with the fallout from that report, which. But it's always you've got to fight every inch of the way. There's never been a point where you say, well, hang on, we've got the government, be it the Department of Health or be it the Treasury, will own up to it and sort it, because even though, for example, last year we had the final report of Sir Brian Langstaff at the public inquiry we had came out. Immediately that came out, the next day Rishi Sunak got on his back legs in Parliament and said it was a day of shame for the British nation. It should never have happened, and we'll put it right. But they haven't yet. They're getting there. They're trying, but of course, there's always a problem. Rishi said that they were, to some extent, empty words, because he then resigned from office, and we've now got a new administration in this country. And we're going through, at the moment, a long process of trying to set up a body to recompense people for the losses they suffered over that 40-year period. I mean, there are a lot of headline numbers floating around. Big play on the fact that the headline number is £11.5 billion, and so that every time I go on radio or TV, or any of the campaigners do that, they hope to get the reaction, well, aren't you happy now because you've got £11.5 billion? Well, we're never going to be happy because of what went on, and certainly the £11.5 billion is still very much in the pocket of the Treasury and is not at the moment being distributed at the speed it might be. I'm sorry that went on for so long, but it's difficult to get it into some sort of context.
We've canvassed several haemophiliacs who've been affected by this, Des Collins, and we've got a list of 8 questions we'd like to put to you. And so, John, could you start with number 1?
Yeah, thanks, Des. Look, you referred to the inquiry that's obviously been recognised in the UK Parliament. Those findings from Sir Brian Langstaff in that inquiry, the Australian government its main argument is that Australia didn't import blood products from the USA. Is it your opinion that the importation of factor concentrates from the USA was the main issue of what occurred in the UK, or was it a combination of that and the other 40-odd criticisms made by Sir Brian Langstaff in his final report?
I think it has to be a combination of the main criticism and the other criticisms. I mean, the origin of infected blood products was the United States, but the question I would ask there, and as I say, you'll have to tell me on this one: did infected blood products get into the Australian culture? What was it? Were they there? And if so, how did they get in? Now, if they're in there, then that must be a refusal of as a result of a refusal of the Australian government from time to time to recognise that they were out there, that had got into the blood product supply, and not come to terms with it. So it's, in that sense, it's not so much simply the import of them, it's knowing that they've got into the system, as it were. They're in the system, they're harmful, and they have to be removed from the system. Well, of course, that's where vested interest comes in, because once they're in the system, a lot of money has been spent in getting them into the system, and no one wants to remove them because it's expensive, and it goes on.
So what we're talking about is a criminal conspiracy, to cover up the fact that mistakes were made, and the less said about it, the better.
Yeah, effectively. I mean, we have not had any criminal charges brought in this country yet. There've been a lot of calls for them, but never got off the ground. We did have in France criminal charges being brought there against senior people in effectively the Department of Health, because they had just refused to look at it and say, we got it wrong. And of course, what you are saying is, I got it wrong on the 1st of January. I didn't put it right till the 1st of December. So that's 12 months where people died. I mean, I'm using those dates as examples, and of course it's back to the schoolboy thing. Once you've got it wrong, you're a lot better to say you got it wrong. But to some extent, it was trying to be objective about it. To some extent, it was such a sea change in attitude was required, and you're looking at that sea change in attitude against a background that the use of blood products was going to change the world, but it did, but to a not in the right way as quickly as it should have done. But it is a refusal of authority, and I don't know what you've got in Australia, but certainly in the UK, it was a refusal of the Department of Health and the Treasury to, and even when the Department of Health, and this all came out in the inquiry, when the Department of Health decided that something should be done, or perhaps we will do something, the Treasury said, no, we're not spending money on that. And of course, I imagine it's the same in Australia. At the end of the day, the Treasury always wins because they hold the purse strings.
Indeed, they do. What impact do you think that the UK's failure to heat treat factor factor concentrates earlier than 1985 had on the overall findings of the UK inquiry and resulting compensation scheme? What do you think?
The small print of the compensation scheme was never going to satisfy all the infected and affected. To some extent, the lines drawn as a result of the inquiry's conclusions are inaccurate. In other words, the inquiry has concluded one thing, and the compensation framework or compensation authority, as it now is, has concluded another thing. We're hopeful that that's not going to result in a lot of satellite litigation. But having said that, I'm already involved in one piece of satellite litigation as a result of the findings of the inquiry and the product of the compensation authority. And I know there's another piece of litigation floating around the High Court, so perhaps it's a pious aspiration to think that there will not be litigation. There will, but we're hoping it will be kept to a minimum. But largely, the litigation will always turn on the fact that the inquiry has concluded one thing, and the effect of that conclusion has been narrowed and not fully accepted, perhaps, although and to some extent avoided, so that you can get away with not doing quite as much as you might have thought was necessary.
You think that the heat treating factor concentrates is a major issue in this case? The failure.
It is. Oh, yeah. I mean, the whole thing came to an end effectively once the heat treatment was put in place, and you then question why the heat treatment wasn't put in place earlier, etc., etc. I mean, that's one of the big issues, and then you've got to the inquiry had to decide, well, when should it have been, and at what point was it wrong not to put it in place? And the views on that varied. But over and above that, you had, I mean, the heat treatment cured something which was happening effectively, because the stuff was there. It was that. The inquiry in this country went back into, should it have been stopped much earlier than that? And we were getting material from Europe back in the very early days, saying, whatever you do, don't use this stuff. And those directives, and there always was, always will be in the UK a variance as to what extent you follow Europe, to what extent you don't follow Europe, etc., etc. But the short point, this was sensible, clinically sound medical and scientific advice coming out of Europe saying, don't use this stuff. It went to the Department of Health in the UK, and they conveniently put it to one side, and they would have these communiques, these directives from Europe, and instead of having meetings with the senior practitioners and clinicians and saying, well, on one side you've got this direction from Europe, on the other side they've got all this, we've got to decide what we should do. What the UK did is say, well, we've got, this is what we're planning to do, and never mention the directives from Europe. The fact, the state of scientific certainty and uncertainty in those days, it was always going to be. I mean, it was always going to be questionable. It's a bit like not long before it. I mean, and smoking can kill you. Well, then a little after, and then but the people said no smoking. If you've got a sore throat, you should have a cigarette. eventually, I think the predominance of opinion was that smoking would kill you and you shouldn't smoke. So there'll always be a point in history where it's more difficult to determine what's right, what's wrong, what's good, what's bad. But at the point in history that we had in the UK, where the directives were coming out of Europe, and someone should have at least listened to them and said, well, this is coming out. What do you clinicians think of it? They didn't. They just put it in a box. It was inconvenient because of course, you go back to the fact that the NHS in this country had invested, could save a lot of money by using blood products, because cryo was much more difficult and complex to administer. And of course, they'd invested a lot of money in the pursuit of that course of action. And of course, they weren't going to change it. So, but yes, certainly the advent of heat treatment was very important, but it was more controlling something which had already happened and should, I think we got down to the inquiry in this country that it should never have happened in the first place. And those findings against the Department of Health and the Treasury are a matter of record in the, but they've got, the Department of Health and Treasury have got broad shoulders and they carry on. But there we are.
There's, in relation to the inquiry, was there an attempt by the UK government to shut this down, to settle it with the?
No, that's one of the questions which is very often asked. And why did we get an inquiry in 2017 from Theresa May, who was the PM at the time, and no one else would be prepared to really consider it? I mean, they'd always say, yes, we've considered it, but the answer is no. And the truth is, well, they didn't consider it because they reached the answer no before they'd even thought about it. We suddenly, in 2017, we had a complete change of heart when Theresa May came out and said, yes, you can have an inquiry. That was as a result of a number of factors. We had become aware, acting for a number of campaign groups, of the extent to which the communiques from Europe had directed that this shouldn't be used and they were being ignored. It's the point I just made about they put the communiques in a drawer and then had meetings as if they didn't exist. We, the campaigners, had become aware of this, largely as a result of the advent of freedom of information. So they'd become aware of it, and we were instructed to take action against the Department of Health for misfeasance in public office. You've got the same sort of thing in Australia, and you have in most common law countries. Misfeasance in public office basically is that what the government has done, or the government department in these circumstances has done, is so appalling that something needs to be done about it, even though it's 40 years later. One of the problems in litigation in this country was there had been litigation back in the late 70s, early 80s, which had settled. And that litigation had settled on a basis whereby effectively, and I really am cutting a very long story short, that cutting effectively on a basis that anyone who was part of that litigation could never sue the government again for this. So any time over the next 40 years, anyone got together and went to lawyers, etc., and said, well, can we do anything? The lawyers always looked at it and said, no, you can't, because you've given an undertaking. You can't sue. It will be struck out the moment you cross the court threshold. That came to us, and our immediate reaction was in exactly that. we thought there's no way this litigation can get underway. But then we decided that there was a chance of misfeasance in public office if the evidence was there. We had some evidence, didn't have it all, but what we did was write to the Department of Health, and this was in May, June, or no, April, I think, of 2017, and said, we're instructed by whatever, and this is misfeasance in public office, and what are you going to do about it? And one of the things that shocked us then was that instead of getting a very curt reply saying, don't bother us, you're mad, you're completely wasted time, we got a not a helpful reply, but a reply which along the lines of, well, we're going to have to look at this very carefully before we can reply. We took the view that that wasn't enough, so we then made an application for a class action based on a misfeasance in public office. Within a few days of that application for a class action being lodged in the High Court in the UK, Theresa May announced there would be a public inquiry. Of course, the public inquiry effectively put the class action on ice, because you generally accepted that you can't have an inquiry and a High Court case looking at the same thing at the same time. You might get different results. So the advent or the issue of the proceedings for a class action, I think, were highly relevant on a much narrower political base. Theresa May at that point had a very, very tiny majority in this country, and I think part of that majority was the Northern Irish contingent, and there were people, half a dozen MPs, maybe something like that, and there were people there who fully supported those few MPs fully supported the haemophilia cause, and I think she thought, if I don't do that, they may vote against me at the next time they get an opportunity, and I'll be out of office. So those are the two factors which came together at the same time, and the rest is history, as we say.
What were the main obstacles that had to be overcome in order to force the inquiry?
The main obstacles were effectively the line which was always taken from Maggie Thatcher's day, and she was one of the first people to be approached before she left office. And her line was, as I say, we've done everything possible. There's nothing, nothing to see here, because it's all an open book, and everything possible has been done to sort this out. So you always had that line floating through for 40 years. Occasionally the line would be broken, and we had a Scottish inquiry called the Penrose inquiry, but it wasn't what we have in, I think you've probably got the same in Australia. The Penrose inquiry wasn't a statutory inquiry. A statutory inquiry in the UK is one which has got powers to compel witnesses, etc., etc., etc. The Penrose inquiry in Scotland didn't have powers to compel witnesses. There was also a parliamentary inquiry in the UK, but that had no powers at all. But what they did, what the bad guys did, was say, well, we've always said that there's nothing to see here. There's nothing which nothing's gone wrong, and it's an open book. And also, you've had two inquiries. You've had a statutory inquiry in the UK, or not a parliamentary inquiry in the UK, and a non-statutory inquiry in Scotland, and they haven't disclosed anything. And of course, the campaigner said, well, clearly the campaign, those inquiries A, we don't believe that there's nothing going on because that something was going on which shouldn't have gone on, and B, the inquiries were toothless, and as a result of being toothless inquiries, if you didn't want to go and give evidence, you didn't. So they never got the evidence they needed. You need a statutory inquiry, and it's got to have the powers to compel people to give evidence. So those were the problems which were the factors which were used, or the arguments which were used time and again to support the decision not to have a public inquiry. And that as I say, that just went on and on and on, and it was, as I say, to some extent, the fact that any litigation which had been commenced would have been struck out because there had been an undertaking not to do it again. But misfeasance in public office, which is very difficult to establish, you've got to show that it's not just a politician making a mistake or a civil servant getting it wrong. It's got to go very, very deep. But I think the proceedings for misfeasance in public office, they thought the better of two evils was to have an inquiry. So they have the inquiry, and those proceedings for misfeasance in public office, incidentally, are still before the court. They were put on ice whilst the inquiry ran. The inquiry reported this time last year, and at the moment they've been stayed, kept on ice until October this year, when the court will look at them again to see whether all necessary issues have been dealt with by the inquiry, be it compensation, etc. And if not, then they will be reactivated.
The wheels of justice move slowly, Johnny.
Indeed, Hoody, that's for sure. Des, it's obviously you've got a lot of experience in the Commonwealth in regards to what's happened here. I mean, I understand your knowledge of what's gone on in Australia wouldn't be as in depth, but do you believe, from what you know, that there would be benefit in a judge-led inquiry here?
Oh, I absolutely. Well, I say it's wrong for me to say I have absolutely no doubt, because I don't have enough information, knowledge, or experience of what's gone on in your country. But from the limited perspective which I have absolutely no doubt that it would benefit from a full public inquiry in Australia. The only reason as I say, the only reason we never had one in this country was because it was inconvenient. They knew it would. I'm saying the bad guys. They knew what it would uncover, and even when Theresa May announced that there would be an inquiry, there was a huge battle to make sure it was a full statutory inquiry, because we have, and I'm sure you have the same in Australia, you have all sorts of parliamentary inquiries, you have non-statutory inquiries, you have panel inquiries. I mean, what they wanted to do in this country was appoint a panel of experts who would just listen to what evidence was put before them and reach a decision as to whether anything went wrong. Well, that was never going to work, because the experts would no doubt be well-meaning, but would never have got to the truth, because you only get to the truth by having the powers of compelling witnesses and evidence, and saying to a Department of Health, we want your documents here at 9 o'clock on Tuesday morning. If the Department of Health can say, well, hang on, guys, I'm not going to do it, and then the inquiry says, well, doesn't matter. It's never going to go. You need those powers where they know that if they get it wrong and if they don't comply, they'll basically end up in jail. And it was only as a result of that the evidence came out. With two earlier inquiries in this country, nothing happened because it was never intended to happen. I mean, and one of the reasons for that is, of course, the bill, the financial bill at the end of the day. I mean, £11.5 billion is one heck of a lot of money, but I think what the campaigners say to that, and I say as well, it wouldn't have been £11.5 billion if you'd sorted it out earlier. I mean, the £11.5 billion, if it had been sorted out on day 3 of following day 1, it would have been infinitesimally small. But it was that insistence that we'll never give in on this, and the more lies we tell, the more lies we've got to tell. And the evidence which came out in the inquiry with a lot of the senior politicians who were around at the time through the 90s and noughties, etc., is that they would come in, the senior politician would come into power, he or she would be appointed to the Department of Health, and politicians are, it depends on your views of politics, but some are good, some are bad. It's like the rest of us. The politician would get behind his or her desk in the Department of Health and say, well, I've been reading in the paper about infected blood, and shouldn't we be doing something about it? Because it seems to be a huge, increasingly an issue. And of course, the views of the civil servants were, don't bother with that. You've got enough to worry about. So if you've got to look at anything, look at what's happening yesterday, what's going to happen tomorrow, because looking at something which happened 30, 40 years ago is not going to get you anywhere. And of course, they would just put off the scent. And I'm sure that is it's human nature, isn't it? I mean, that's what happens. And of course, the new head of the department, be it the Department of Health or elsewhere, is going to say, well, hang on, I've just been elected as a politician. I've just been to the cabinet office, and I've got this posh job at the Department of Health, and don't really want. I'd like to keep this for a couple of 3 years, and then move on to education or defence or something. So I'm not going to rock the boat, because if I rock the boat, I'll rock the Treasury's boat, and the Treasury won't spend any money on it. So it just never got done, and that did come out from a number of senior politicians who got into the witness box and said we should have reacted more at the time. It was reasonably clear that there was something wrong, and very clear that further investigation was necessary. But we took the easy line, because and we shouldn't have done. But and I'm sure that's likely to be replicated in Australia, because it was certainly replicated in Canada, about which I've got some experience. So yeah, no, it's a question of people doing the right thing when they should do it. Doesn't always happen.
Yes, we've been talking to a lot of haemophiliacs in Australia who've been affected by these tainted products, and they're flabbergasted by the fact that the Haemophilia Foundation of Australia has agreed with the government stance that there's no issue to investigate in Australia. I mean, it's incredible. I don't know who they're talking to, but what role did the UK Haemophilia Society play in forcing the inquiry?
The UK Haemophilia Society played no role in forcing the inquiry to be set up. Going back to what I was saying with the directives coming out of Europe in the early days, and not being recognised or acted upon by the Department of Health, the Haemophilia Society in the UK at that time supported a policy of nothing is required. They were totally negative. Why? I never really figured out why, because it wasn't an issue on which to be negative. It might have been an issue for saying we don't know, it's too early, tricky one, this, let's get some help. But they were totally negative, and they supported the government basically, and that led to a position where a lot of the campaigners just washed their hands of the Haemophilia Society. One thing I haven't mentioned is it was that in the 40-year period, you had a number of you had a number of campaign groups becoming formed and disbanding, and largely the history of those campaign groups was that they'd get together, they'd fight a good fight, they'd lose, and then fall out with each other. The members would fall out on them, and again, which is human nature. You know, they say, well, that campaign didn't work, we didn't get this, we didn't get that, and then they blame each other. So you had a very you had a community which had a common aim. I mean, you couldn't have more of a common aim, but they just didn't. They just didn't get on with each other, and they became so frustrated as a community that you had endless campaign groups that wouldn't speak to each other, and because of that, and I raised that in the Haemophilia Society sort of fell into a campaign group, if you like, which some people spoke to, some people didn't. Some people recognised that it had been totally wrong to support the government in the early days, and some people failed to recognise that. But it was all it was just all in a complete mess. What happened? But I think it's generally accepted, apart from with people who, well, I'm not going to be overcritical. It's generally accepted, or even that the Haemophilia Society in this country at that time did not act as it should have done, and did not support the community. And I don't think anyone would really argue with that seriously. What happened was that you had this completely diverse community with no one really speaking to each other, and the government being quite happy with that, because there was no effective voice out there. A guy called Jason Evans set up a campaign group called Factor 8. And that he pushed that campaign group very, very hard. And one of the things he did was he didn't join any of the individual campaign groups. He had a loose and cordial relationship, as far as I know, and I should know because he was my client, so I should know that. He had a loose and cordial relationship with all the groups. And focused on what brought them together as opposed to what drove them apart. And that is effectively how we came into it, because I met Jason Evans at a meeting in the House of Commons in Parliament. And it was a meeting of cases in the UK which had gone nowhere. It wasn't just blood cases; it was any case where you had where it seemed that the fight had been lost. So, and I was there for another client and another case altogether, and I met Jason Evans, and we chatted a bit, and he gave a presentation at the House of Commons, and the presentation was basically for infected blood products. And I turned to the person I was with at the time and said to her, "You're a lot younger than me, but this has all, and you won't remember, but this has all been dealt with years ago. I don't know what this guy's talking about, because it's all been looked at. There is no problem anymore. He's just flogging a dead horse." and that wasn't because I had any experience of any of the issues. All I'd been is a bystander through the relevant period of history, and I thought, well, it's all been sorted. He nevertheless convinced me at that meeting in the House of Commons that something hadn't been done which should have been done. He came along to see me a couple of months later, and we chatted, and he introduced me to the other campaign groups, and we were able to loosely affiliate in terms of the first meeting I had with all the campaign groups. It was quite tense because they didn't like each other, and because Jason Evans had decided that, in his view, we should be the lead solicitors in it. Of course, people didn't. It's politics, and they didn't like that. But anyway, it was that. It was that development which meant that I was able to go to the inquiry, which was being set up. This meeting that was being set. This was in the late 2017, and say, look, there are talks of panel inquiries. There's talks of this. We now represent the entire community and all these campaign groups, and this is what they want. And it was that unification, for even though they're all fallen out again, because life is like that. But for that moment in time, they spoke as one voice, and speaking as one voice on one issue is incredibly important, and it gave the government less chance to divide and rule. At that moment, it gave them no chance to divide and rule. And in fairness, the campaign groups have, even though they do have individual differences still, and will always have those differences, they remained together throughout the inquiry and gave evidence separately, but to the same positive end, as which we all know that positive end is this shouldn't have happened, and we want to make sure it shouldn't happen. It doesn't happen again.
There's putting together a brief like this is a massive undertaking. I suppose if something were to take off in Australia, lawyers would be looking for assistance. Is that something that your firm and yourself would be willing to provide?
By all means, yeah. I mean, that's not that wouldn't be a problem. I mean, we're a very small firm. We grow bigger from time to time, depending on what cases we're working on, and I like to think that's one of our strengths, if you like, that we've got a core group of about 30, 40 people who will have worked on any number of big cases, and they can bring that, even though the outlying, sometimes we go out to over 100 or 150, but the outlying group comes and goes as necessary. But we're more than happy to we're more than happy to help if that were possible. We're I don't know whether you've picked up on Netflix that there's a documentary. No, it's a 4-part series about contaminated land in Grubbery, which wasn't cleared up properly, and we're behind that. So we're doing a lot of work all over the place on that at the moment. So yeah, we would be happy to. But I mean, what I really can't understand is, and I couldn't understand at the time when we came into this in 2017, I was surprised that you guys hadn't been there before us, but you hadn't, and I suspect for the same sort of reasons, that you're getting the same, you're possibly getting the same, well, there was nothing wrong, nothing to see here, so go away, you're just a lot of angry people angry for its own sake, with a load of lawyers who are just chasing fees. So go away. So I imagine that's what's happened in Australia. Um, but hopefully, I would like to think that the fact that the UK has done something, and it was a very big ask of the UK to do it, because as I said, when we came, it was just like sort of, you can't do that. The fact that the UK has done it means it can be done. It can be done after a long time. The cost of doing it, the cost of be it in terms of the inquiry, the cost of the implementing the findings of the inquiry. Yeah, it's expensive, but this is life. I mean, you really can't say we got it wrong, we got it so wrong, it's going to cost us a lot of money, so we're going to get it wrong. It just can't be right. Can't be right.
Jess, we've only got a few minutes left, and we really do appreciate your time. But do you think that reopening a previous case is possible, and do you think that might help to force an inquiry?
The depends. I mean, the problem we had with reopening the previous case was that we had to, even though I say it myself, we had to think of a clever way to do it. Because if we had hit it head on and said we're suing the government or the Department of Health for negligence, breach of statutory duty, which is pretty much what you guys would do if you were doing that in Australia, because you're not, your laws are not that different from ours. You would be met, I suspect, by this is a strikeout application. I think you would have to be. I mean, I'm assuming that there has been litigation in Australia at some point which would have to be overturned. That, as I say, there was in the UK, and what the UK did with it back in the day was not only get the judgment against them. I mean, it's always the case that if you fight a case and it comes to a conclusion, you can't fight the same case again, because that's just using the court for no good end, and it's called res judicata. I'm probably called the same in your part of the world. So no, that's not that. You need to think of a new way around it. You need to you've got to the phrase I always use. You need a little bit of fancy footwork. Hitting it head on will just mean you get knocked out and you're dead again. You need to have some fancy footwork. It was tried to some extent in this country before we became involved in using, for example, product liability legislation. If you buy something in the shops and it's defective, you can sue for the defective product, not the negligence in bringing the defective product to the market. It's a statutory offence, sort of. So that was tried and that was successful, but it didn't go far enough, because you've actually got to go. You've got to go to the heart of it. You've got to go to the fact that the government knew about this. If it didn't know about it, it should have known about it. And the fact that it did nothing was instrumental in everyone suffering the losses which they did.
Well, Johnny, we can honestly say that if anybody in this country is still thinking the government is acting in our best interest, we need to rethink it. And we've seen the government do amazing, very theatrical apologetics to various people and victims of certain things, thalidomide and the stolen generation. And I'm sure in 50 years' time, there'll be an apology to people who've suffered vaccine injury. And now we're in a position where, are they going to just stall it off until 50 years from the 70s when all this happened, which is coming up very close now? There'll be an apology to haemophiliacs and victims of infected bloods. I mean, we don't want an apology half a century later. We need action taken now in order to stem the flow of the damage being done and get these people the treatments and the benefits that they need to keep living. because they acted in good faith based on government advice in all these things, and it let them down. So, Des, it's been really great having you with us tonight. We thank you so much for your time. We always close with a prayer. We might do that, John. Dear Lord, Father in heaven, we just seek justice. We seek it to be lasting, and we seek it to be swift. And Lord, we just pray that truth will prevail and bring justice to those haemophiliacs and others, all these people affected by medical tyranny and malfeasance. We just pray that you will guide and lead our lawyers, our survivors, and those of us who care in the right direction. We pray in Jesus' name. Amen. Johnny, you've often been heard to say,
you just couldn't make this stuff up.
You couldn't make this stuff up. Des Collins, thank you so much for coming on. It's been a real pleasure. We hope we can talk to you again soon if there are any further outcomes. And I'm sure some people will be wanting to contact you regards support in Australia. And to all our listeners at home, thank you so much for watching us again. Don't forget, this is a great country because you live in it. Don't give up the fight. Stay true to yourselves and stay out of the trees. God bless you all, and bye for now.
Thank you.